Frank Metzmeier.
I'm Claire Metzmeier.
My name is Marilyn Evans.
Verna Mae Smith.
My name is Jim Warner.
My name is Corinne Gutjar.
Richard Doyle.
Mary Bell Chapman.
My official name is Harold, Harold, Chapman, Chapman, but I'm usually called Chappie.
My name is Robert Clary.
Patricia Clary.
Robin Warner.
My name is Kofi, Kofi, and my last name is Nevis.
My wife and I were living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was pastoring a small church on the north side of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When I heard the news, I had just driven into our driveway and stopped, and our next door neighbor, and his name was Ralph Labus. Ralph Labus came running out of his house, Bob! And I knew obviously something had happened. And he said, have you heard that President Kennedy was just assassinated?
I was 19 years old and I was in a foster home, and I went to Princeton High School, and that was my 12th year. And I remember going up the hallway. Princeton High School had this long hallway, and at the end of the hallway was the choir and the band, and I was in both. And I remember going up that ramp, and something came over the PA system. It was a student that was yell, "The son of a bitch is killed." So we didn't think nothing about it. We just knew that somebody was playing a joke, and who was killed we didn't understand. But when I got to the choir room, everybody was crying.
Well, I was 13 and in my English classroom in junior high. Our teacher had left the room and was out in the hallway. Seemed to be some agitation in the hallway. It was kind of curious, and I think I had a seat towards the front of the class and was peeking around. And then she came into the classroom and said she wanted to make an announcement that the President of the United States had been shot.
I was at Allegheny County Hospital working as a med tech in the chemistry department there. And someone came into our chemistry lab and told us that this had happened.
I was in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and I was a principal of a high school for African students, and that was where
I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan in the chemistry department, and I was at work in the chemistry building when people started talking about it.
So we were living in Centerville, Ohio, which is just a little bit south of Dayton, Ohio. And I was going to a parent-teacher conference for my son who was in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And I was driving there, and they made the announcement of the shooting of President Kennedy.
I was in the 7th grade, and I can remember meeting with my 7th grade art teacher. We were talking about an art project, and I can remember sitting there, and another teacher came to the door as we were meeting and looked upset, and she said, the president's just been shot.
At that time I was a captain in the United States Army Dental Corps. I was a dentist at the Center Dental Clinic, Fort Bliss, Texas.
I was in West Africa, Sierra Leone, West Africa. We were teachers over there in a high school. Well, in Sierra Leone it was Friday evening, and we were showing a movie to the school kids, and somebody came into the building and said, "The president's been shot." And immediately I thought, oh, some African president, probably, because there was a lot of uproar in Africa then. And then somebody said, no, it's Kennedy.
And I was with my husband, Frank, stationed in El Paso, Texas. He was in the military. I was taking a sunbath. Another woman came out of her house and said, "Kennedy's been shot." The reaction on Fort Bliss at the time, Fort Bliss was equipped so it could be a closed base. That means that you couldn't get on base unless your ID was checked. At the time, it was a little loose. You could get on base without your ID being checked. But when that happened, the base immediately closed.
Would have been 23 at the time. I had 2 children. Deborah would have been 4, Greg was 2. And my mother had died on November the 9th. So on that day, I happened to be down at my father's, which is about a half an hour from where I lived in Indianapolis, and going through some things, my mother's, and had my children with me. And while I don't remember what we had on TV, what program, but I think it was interrupted, and with the announcement that he had been shot.
Yes, Kennedy has played a role in some development aspects of not just Ghana, but Africa as a whole. And as a result of that, Ghanaians, from what I understood later on, they felt it. They felt hurt. They felt the pain that most Americans felt here as well.
Took my breath away, and I was real sad. I think the whole country was sad. We mourned that passing of JFK. When I got home, I remember turning the TV on and was glued to the TV to find out, if there was more news, more good news. But at first they said that he was alive, he was still alive. But then it came back that the doctors had worked on him and that he had passed. And we were sorry. Well, after JFK was assassinated, they quickly went to trying to solve who killed him. And they came up with a person. So the government thought if they came up with a person, that will settle it and we would be okay. But we were not okay with who they chose. We still say it was a conspiracy.
Didn't know if we were going to go to war immediately or if we were going to be invaded by someone. Just didn't know. Neither did anyone else. The country was in sort of a state of flux. Initial information, we didn't know the president had been killed. We thought he'd been shot, but didn't know whether he was living still or not. Did not know whether we were going to be bombing someone or someone was going to be bombing us. The post was shut down. We did go deer hunting later on. They opened up, I think the reason they opened up to let the military deer hunters go was so that we could be out in areas where there were some civilians, make sure that no one was going to try to infiltrate the base. It was a very, very scary time. It affected the country. It brought the country together for a while. It was a time when people were questioning all forms of government. Not only foreign government, but ours also.
I think people were very shocked that something like this could happen and would happen, and where do we go from here?
I saw how the government dealt with the change in power. And there was grief throughout the nation as people were crying that this young president was gone, that they loved so much. But it was just about peace, and our governor had brought out the National Guard at Kent State University deal with these protesters, and unfortunately, one of the men in the National Guard shot and killed some students, a student or more, I don't remember. And so then there were demonstrations all over the country from that. King, well, actually he was before Bobby Kennedy. So it was a very scary time. Even George Wallace was shot and paralyzed and was in a wheelchair. So all of a sudden the world wasn't quite what it was when I was a child.
Well, I think it increased the feeling of vulnerability that we, just assume, well, president, he can do anything almost, and then this wakes you up to, you have to keep your eyes open and watch, and he isn't God.
Eventually changed the political outlook quite a bit, because it brought Lyndon Johnson to power, because he was the vice president at the time and he took over the government. And that, I think, changed the course of the politics quite a bit. Lyndon Johnson was a much more experienced politician, so he was able to deal with Congress much more effectively, I think. So he got things done that JFK was not being successful with.
Johnson signed this civil rights legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So wasn't that a positive thing?
I didn't think it was.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't think it was. It didn't bring back JFK,
Mm.
And it didn't bring our boys back from the war. I mean, yeah, he signed that piece of paper, but why did he sign it? Never had a Catholic president before, and everybody was talking, against having a Catholic president, because I don't know why, but I never did listen to why. I listened to, you don't want to vote for that one. So I fought against it. I really was. But after he was elected, I was okay. I was glad. Yeah. So that was my president.
I knew that we'd have a different president because LBJ was a whole totally different man and type of leader than President Kennedy was, but I didn't know how that would play out. There were some changes that happened afterwards that I would never have anticipated happening, and that was things like the passage of the Civil Rights Act under, when Johnson was president. And if there was ever a segregationist, it was LBJ, and for him to realize that something had happened and changed, that the Civil Rights Act got passed, it really blew my mind, quite frankly.
I don't know, I think you had to get used to the fact that Johnson was president and Kennedy was a young hero, someone adored by the country, and Johnson could be pretty abrasive. Johnson did a lot of good things in his presidency. So, you had to get used to the fact, and I think the country was in mourning for quite a while, and yet having to try to get used to a new person.
It was kind of blurred together because, when Nixon was in office at the time, the Vietnam War was happening, there was a lot of suspicion of Nixon and really distrust, what the government was doing. And of course, we were all worried we were going to get drafted and sent to Vietnam. So, there was just a general feeling of distrust.
Well, I suppose before that we thought that, those in our generation had never had that happen. We thought it would never happen. And, well, there was a lot of conspiracy theories, and people thought, these people were behind it, or that people.
The assassination itself came at a time where I think that America was beginning to grow in a different direction. all-inclusive direction. That doesn't mean that Kennedy was perfect. No human being is perfect. And so that is probably why the assassination hit certain class of people more.
Because they didn't know and because it was a shocker. You know, you felt a little fearful. There were no more open cars in presidential motorcades. You know, Kennedy and the governor of Texas both were shot. They were in convertibles. And that stopped immediately.
Government went wild after that, you know. The leader was gone, the one who laid the path for us to believe. And the government was it just was no good after that. It didn't hold no meaning after that. And I don't know whether that affected the government more than it affected the people, because they had high hopes with Kennedy in there, you know, and Jacqueline and all that. It was our Prince Charming, and Jacqueline was our princess, you know, and the government didn't seem the same. We didn't really care about the government after that. You know, if we thought we cared about it, we knew it would be taken from us again. And so that's the belief we had. Why believe in the government, you know, when they could be assassinated and killed like this?
I can remember when I was in college that we knew that the Warren Commission was, I can't remember if they'd finished their report. I think they had, and it was sealed and made secret, so that nobody really knew, you know, what they concluded. And this was at the time when the Vietnam War was happening, and there was a lot of distrust of the government because of the war. And I was on campus at UC at the time, so there was a lot of anti-war sentiment.
13, there was a gathering at on the 50th anniversary of his relatives and people who had been in his administration. And they were interviewed by Bob Schieffer on, I think it's on CBS. And one of his nephews, Ted Kennedy Jr., said that he believed government could do great things, and I think people really miss that now. They're not as, I don't think we're as trusting of big government.
Because of those theories that you just mentioned, people don't really trust government, because a whole lot of things have happened which can be attributed to the government doing. And once those things come to light, then people begin to question certain things. And once you begin to question certain things, then the distrust comes in. But let's suppose that that water is there, and I drank the water. You and I are the only person in this room. And when you ask me, oh, did you drink the water? I said, no. You may not say anything, but next time when you get water, will you leave it there? See, it wouldn't have mattered to you probably if I had told you. Say, oh yeah, I drank it, and you might ask me why, and I would say, because I was thirsty. But if I didn't tell you the truth and I lied to you, then at the back of your mind, oh, if he took that water, what else will he do? You get the point now? Yeah, so I think the same way, this is just a small analogy, but it's the same way that people approach government in certain areas, in certain things.
So there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of sides and issues, and people became suspicious of government. So we had suspicion growing. The FBI, the CIA, all of those things were, people were questioning. We'll never know truth of everything, but I have no reason not to believe that they found the truth.
As you probably know, there were a lot of theories about the JFK assassination, who was really responsible for it, so that started a controversy that has lasted for quite a few years. A lot of people did not believe the official conclusions of the committee that investigated the assassination. So there are a lot of conspiracy theories that are still going on to this day.
I think there was certain pessimism and frustration about, you know, sort of how do we get things back on track? Where do we go from here?
I would think they probably were surprised and again felt more vulnerable. I don't know as it changed a lot the relationships to other countries, which we were more aware of, although feeling like they knew Kennedy, but then wondering, well, who's going to be there and all of that. The change can bring some uneasiness.
That the distrust began from that era. There was a distrust. Remember now, there had been wars and things going on before that, in other, even if it's not in the U.S., in other parts of the world, including the Second World War, the situation in Cuba, and so there were a whole lot of things going on, or that had gone on before the assassination, which may have made some people question certain things. That from that point on, people felt they were not told the truth about the assassination itself. Well, there will always be something that will cause distrust of government, not in government, but of a government, period.
When Lyndon Johnson became president, which was immediately after Kennedy was pronounced dead, LBJ was a different personality. The Vietnam War was in the beginning stages. The government, the people didn't like war. Kennedy didn't particularly like war, but LBJ handled it. His philosophy was a little different than Kennedy's, as I remember, but life went on.
In retrospect, you realize how much, as much as you feel the tragedy and understand it, but your daily life absorbs you so much that sometimes you just don't get involved.
I thought, and I still think, that the Castro regime was somehow involved in it, because there had been an attempt by the Kennedy administration to assassinate Castro, to invade Cuba and assassinate Castro, the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion. And I think there may have been some retaliation for that, but I don't think we'll ever know the truth of that.
Well, I find it hard to believe that it was only one person, one lone gunman that did it. So I don't know if I would call it a conspiracy as much as I just have to think there may have been somebody supporting, him. Well, I think the fact that the Warren Commission sealed the report really, I think, created a lot of distrust, because why are they hiding it? Why isn't there transparency? That, I think, did sow the seeds of distrust. But I don't think until Nixon, did what he did, and the Watergate break-in and his subsequent resignation, that really, I think, created the real distrust.
Do you know who C.S. Lewis is? He's a writer and writes wonderful Christian books, and he died the same day that John Kennedy died. Nobody knew the day that C.S. Lewis died. I mean, it wasn't broadcast or anything that we know of. And there was a big to-do about Kennedy's death.
And for me, one of the most memorable things that I recall was seeing on the news, probably that afternoon or the evening news that day, that in a classroom in one of the elementary schools in Dallas, that when that news was portrayed to that classroom, some of the children actually stood up and cheered. Probably about 3 or 4 years later, my wife and I were living in St. Louis and I was doing graduate study work in seminary, and I was writing a paper on an incident that the city government of St. Louis had done a few years earlier. And that was St. Louis was a very segregated city in those days, probably still is, but it was in those days. And the city council in St. Louis passed a fair housing ordinance, one of the earliest fair housing ordinances passed by any city in that part of the country. And I was doing research in the city newspaper libraries, reviewing the literature about that assassination. And I went to those newspapers, and there were 2 major newspapers in those days, the St. Louis Post and the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Neither of those papers had headlines or anything that I could find about the assassination.
You mean the?
I mean the passing of the passing of the fair housing ordinance. How did that happen? So and then I looked at the date of the newspapers, and it dawned on me. November 22nd, and the papers were published November 23rd. And of course the front page was all about the assassination. But that act was passed, and there was not a massive uproar about it in the city because the city didn't know it.
If you live through something, if you experience something, then you feel it, you see it, and it becomes part of you.
It was a tragedy for the country.